A 91-year-old woman went to the doctor and found out she had been pregnant for 60 years. This was a tough year for her because her husband had died and her health was getting worse. She had a fall, so she had to go to the hospital far from her home. At the hospital, they discovered something surprising. She was pregnant, and there was a lot more to her story than people realized. Estela Melendez, who was 91 years old, and her husband, Manuel Gonzalez, had a good life. They lived in a small town by the ocean in Chile, not too far from the big city. They were married for 74 years and were very close. They didn't have a fancy house, but they always had enough to eat because Manuel worked as a fisherman. But in January 2015, things took a sad turn for Estela. Her husband Manuel, who was 91 like her, passed away quietly. Now Estela had to live alone and do all the housework and cooking by herself. It must have been really hard for her because they had spent most of their lives together, and they had many experiences, both good and bad. But there was one thing that made them really sad, and it was that they couldn't have children, and they kept this secret for a long time. Estela and Manuel always felt remorseful about not being able to have a family. It was something that they had both longed for, but early on, they found out that Estela was unable to conceive and get pregnant. When interviewed and asked to look back at her long life without a family to raise, Estela simply remarked, "We suffered tremendously for this reason." The reason behind them still not being able to have a baby was a mystery for decades. To make matters worse, a few years before her husband passed, Estela also discovered she had a long-standing tumor in her uterus. However, soon the tumor would be the least of her worries. In the year following Manuel's passing, the widow Estela would find herself, unfortunately, facing a slew of medical issues. She'd find that her hearing began to rapidly deteriorate and her mobility quickly dwindled. On top of this, she developed a severe case of arthritis, and things only continued to get worse after her 91st birthday. While her body was already slowing down significantly, things would change when Estela tripped and fell while tending to her home. While the fall didn't cause any permanent damage, it was an eye-opener for the elderly woman, and she knew that she had to make some changes in her life. It had become obvious to Estela that her body was giving way, as performing basic tasks alone began to require a lot of effort. She contacted her friend and pleaded for a ride to the Claudio Vicuna Hospital in San Antonio. It was no simple 4 blocks away to see her doctor, but it would require finding someone who could take her on a journey of 40 miles. Concerned over the fall, the doctor wanted to put Estela through a full-body X-ray. At her age, the doctor knew that she really couldn't afford to take any heavy damage. It was during the X-ray process that they would soon discover something that would leave them deeply startled. To begin with, the doctors who examined Estela thought that they would merely be looking at something they had already seen, a second tumor. Tumors were nothing new to her. She had had a bout with cancer back in the 1980s. However, wanting to be sure of their findings, the doctor decided to perform a second X-ray. That's when they found out that they could have been very wrong about Estela's condition. After carefully analyzing their findings, they came to the conclusion that Estela had never had a tumor in the first place. What she was carrying inside of her was something far more serious than a mere tumor. The doctors had to do a double take or two each time they examined the X-ray. What they were about to reveal felt almost otherworldly. It turns out that Estela was technically pregnant. She'd been carrying the remains of a long-deceased fetus. However, the biggest shock came when they learned how long it had been inside her. After studying the fetus, the doctors were able to conclude that she'd been pregnant with it for roughly 60 years. The news had to have come as devastating to Estela. All of her life, she and Manuel wanted nothing more than a child to raise. Seemingly deprived of this ability, all the while, her unborn child was unknowingly inside of her for more than half a century. The reality of her situation shocked Estela, her doctors, and many locals in their corner of Chile. Not many people had ever heard of such a terrifying condition, and yet, as it turns out, Estela's condition wasn't as mysterious as many people might have thought. Estela's condition is called lithopedion, and it affects a small percentage of women across the world. The names of these fetuses themselves are lithopedions or stone babies. These unique specimens are the result of a fetus that begins to develop outside of a pregnant woman's womb. These kinds of fetuses are extremely risky for both mother and child, and if not handled quickly, the condition can result in the demise of both. However, if the fetus is small and underdeveloped, it can be gradually absorbed into the pregnant mother's body. Yet, this wasn't the case with Estela. What doctors saw in his elderly woman was something that had scarcely been seen in modern history. If the fetus is too developed, it won't be absorbed by the mother. Rather, it calcifies in the uterus. Usually, people with a stone baby will just go into surgery and get it removed. Sadly, the doctors determined that this wouldn't be a possible route for 91-year-old Estella. Surgery wasn't something she was likely to survive. Even though the news wasn't great, Estella didn't mind it much because it reminded her of her late husband. Hearing about the stone baby added to the sadness in her already tough life, but not everything the doctor said was bad. In a way, Estella and her husband's biggest dream had always been with them, even if they didn't realize it together. That's very sad, and it made Estella feel bad for most of her life. She felt like she wasn't the same as everyone else because she couldn't have children. Estella saw her sisters and friends having children while she couldn't, and that was hard for her, especially when having kids was something many people did in her time and place. When the doctors discovered that Estella had been pregnant for more than 60 years, it was a big surprise. People all over the world wanted to know her story, and she became famous. Big newspapers and TV stations like the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, and CNN came to Chile to talk to her. Many people thought that the elderly woman would cry a lot when she faced all the attention, but she surprised everyone with her reaction. When the world met Estella Melendez, they might have expected to see someone who was very sad because of all the tough things that happened to her. After all, losing your husband after 74 years and finding out you've been pregnant for 60 years is not easy to handle. But Estella was calm and collected when she sat in front of the cameras. She held onto her cane, looked at the person asking questions very carefully, and spoke nicely. Even though she went through many sad things, she seemed really strong, and people didn't expect that. Estella went through some really tough times, and when people heard about it, they felt sad and confused. A lady named Julie said, "It's so sad. It could have brought her husband some happiness if they knew earlier." But Julie also said something hopeful. In a way, they did have a child. She carried it with her for over 60 years, and even though they can't remove it now, she still has a part of him with her. Some people found Estella's story relatable because, although her condition is rare, there are similar cases. Lauren Pearl talked about her sister, who also had a stone baby, not her own baby, but a twin. It might sound strange, but it's not as uncommon as you might think. Most people just don't know it's happening until something goes wrong. Now, many people wonder what happened to Estella after all this attention. She's back to her normal life in her small seaside town in Chile, away from the spotlight. This condition is very rare, only happening about 300 times in medical records. But strangely, a few cases have happened not too far from each other. For example, in 2013, an older woman in Colombia had a stone baby for 40 years, and in 2019, a woman in Ethiopia had one for 22 years. In both cases, they had surgery to remove it. However, it's not always necessary because it usually doesn't harm the person carrying it. Luckily, the surgery was successful for the woman in Ethiopia.